All right, welcome everyone. So we already did a little bit of the introductions, but I'll do sort of a repeat just for the recording. So I'm Ryan Chesler. I'm a data scientist at H2O. I've worked with language models and a bunch of other things for a long time. I'm a Kaggle Grandmaster. I've just trained a lot of models. So we'll be covering transformers specifically, and we'll be learning all about them in the next few weeks. So the first thing that I wanted to start with is just kind of the roadmap, because this is going to take us a few weeks and I want to lay out the stuff that I want to cover, but this is also an opportunity to get some feedback from everyone else. What do you want to see covered? Because this is something that I'm kind of laying down the tracks as we're going along with the train. So if there's anything that you really want to see, I can kind of divert us and get us to cover that. So I'll lay out the roadmap and we can talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go into the first week's actual content. So week one, I just want to kind of introduce transformers, give a little bit of motivation. So why should we care about transformers? They're just this random model. We'll talk a bit about that and we'll understand why you should care about them. And then I'll do a little crash course on transformers. So there's this HuggingFace package called Transformers, and it has all of this great content in it. And so we'll be going over some of that, and we'll be breaking down into the pieces and understanding what's available to us and how we can use that. So we'll be looking at the models, we'll be looking at tokenizers, data sets, and the trainer. And then at the end of today, we'll even fine-tune our own first model. So hopefully we should have enough time to get through all of that. We'll see. So just warning for this week's content, I was busy in Mountain View all week, so I had to kind of scramble this together. So my idea is to polish these off even more and then do kind of a final set of published notebooks that will kind of be self-contained. So we'll see the notebooks later, but I'm planning on iterating on these even more so we can get that content in there well. For today, I'll guide us through it, but eventually I'll clean it up some more, and we'll have more polished, dedicated resources to look at. So week two, I plan to show us gathering data. So one of the things that I'm personally interested in is pre-training our own models. So a lot of the existing work, you borrow some model from Google or Amazon or Facebook or whoever else, and then you go and you tweak that a little bit to train for your data. But there's not that much content out there on the actual pre-training, because that's kind of left to those big companies. And so I wanted to take us down that path of, let's look at what pre-training actually includes. How do you gather data for that? How do you do the pre-training? What are the implications for down the road, how your model will perform? If you have some very specific domain data, is there something useful you can do to train your own model? That's kind of what I'm interested in. So week two, I think the major thing that we'll be looking at is just, how do you gather data? Where is data available? What do you need? How do you get it? Is it possible to get enough data to pre-train your own model? So that's something we'll be looking at in week two. In week three, I'm planning on having us actually do the pre-training. And so we'll discuss what even is pre-training, what various tasks are there, what can we do with this, and how will we kind of store the knowledge of that data we gathered inside of this model. And so that's what that pre-training task will do, is it will prime our model to have a bunch of knowledge inside of it so that we can do other things down the road. So the pre-training is something that kind of captures knowledge inside of the model, and then later you might want to transfer that for some specific task. So the first step is just getting your model to store some useful information, basically. So at that point, I will assume that we've gathered some data, we've picked out a pre-training task, and then we'll actually try to run it that week. That's the goal of week three. Um, yeah, I don't think we're going to be doing billion parameter models, but we'll try. So week 4, we'll assume that we've been able to successfully pre-train a model. And so once we have that pre-trained model, we can actually fine tune it on our specific task. So you might have some classification or regression or entity extraction or something else down the road that you want to specifically train your model to do. And so we'll work on that in this week 4. And so one of the things that I think would be interesting for us to do is we can fine tune the model that we pre-trained. We can fine tune a model that was just randomly initialized that we didn't do any pre-training on. And then we can compare that against already pre-trained models. So we could take BERT or Roberta or something else that's already been pre-trained, and we can say, okay, how did we do? How do we compare against the stuff that's already out there? Maybe for our specific task, we've actually beaten what Google or Facebook or whoever has published. So that would be interesting to look at the different specific tasks that we might want to do, and we can measure performance against it and see if we've been successful or if we've at least gotten in that direction. And then after that, I think it would be useful for us to have a discussion of how we actually perform. So my assumption is that we're going to beat the randomly initialized model. We're probably not going to beat the pre-trained model, and we can discuss why that is. Do we need more parameters? Do we need more data? Do we need to train it for longer? What do we do to scale it up and try to beat those pre-trained models? So we'll discuss some of that stuff. And then after that, assume that we got some good model that we actually want to use. I'll talk a bit about deploying this. So this is something that I've spent a lot of my time on recently. We have these deployed models, and then someone comes to us and they say, we want to do inference on 300 million pages. And it's just like, oh, crap. That's going to be very expensive. How do we optimize this a bit? Do we want to do inference on CPU, GPU? Do we convert it to Onyx? Do we convert it to OpenVINO? Do we do TensorRT? There's a million different technologies out there to actually optimize your models. You can do mixed precision. There's all kinds of stuff out there. And so we'll have some discussion on how do we make an efficient API for our model to be able to serve predictions. And then we'll talk about the various different ways that you might want to serve predictions. So batch prediction or online prediction. And there's other things. There's other things in there as well. So that's kind of the roadmap that I wanted to lay out. I think it's aggressive to say that we'll finish this all in 5 weeks, but we will see. I'm gonna try to get us there, and we might have to split it up to some smaller chunks if we run out of time. So yeah, that's the roadmap that I have for now. If anyone has any suggestions, feel free to throw them in the chat or throw them in Slack or message me some other way. If there's anything that you want to see, this is very flexible. I have week 1 and I have nothing else. So if you want to guide this in some way, I'm totally open to that. So yeah, we'll be covering the HuggingFace transformers package. That's where we'll start. Yeah. And yeah, so Ted's mentioning in chat that we're going to take more than 5 calendar weeks because we have the holidays and everything else in between. So we have this week, and then do we have next week? And then after that, we have a couple weeks break. Is that the lineup, Ted?
I don't think we finalized. We can probably do the 17th, but I'm assuming that the 24th and 31st,
yeah,
we're not going to meet. So we'll have at least 2 weeks break in the middle, and so this will go into January. We're not going to finish this just in 5 consecutive weeks.
Yeah. Okay, got it. So there's questions about if we'll do image data. I won't personally set something up for image data, but I think that we'll give you the tools to modify it and do that yourself if you want to. So the notebooks that I'm using are fairly general. They're optimized for text stuff, but ultimately, if you wanted to plug in your own data and use an image transformer instead of a text transformer, it wouldn't be too hard to swap that out. I'm hoping. I'll be more specialized about the text stuff, but you should be able to handle images if you really want to. There's a question about GPU requirement. So for this, my hope is to kind of reasonably fit everything inside of a Google Colab notebook. So every week will be a separate notebook, and Google Colab gives you access to one GPU for, I think it's 12 hours or something like that. So the intention is not to scale up a massive model and go for it. It's kind of just prove the concept all the way out. And then if you want to scale it up on your own, you can figure out how to do that on your own hardware. So there isn't any GPU requirement necessarily. You should be able to handle just with Google Colab everything that we're doing. So if you don't have a GPU system at home, or you don't want to spin anything up on EC2 or Google Cloud or whatever, you should be able to fit everything just in the notebook. So just prefacing that does mean that we're a little bit limited. I don't expect us to go and beat GPT-3. I just want us to be like, okay, I understand the building blocks. Let's train a basic model. And we can prove that we beat randomly initialized models. And if we want to train for longer, if we want to scale up the data and everything like that, then we have the tools to do that. Actually, scaling up is not extremely hard. You just have to transfer your code, transfer some data, and then run it on a more powerful system. So that's the hope. Any other questions before I hop over?
One more question in the chat. Do you have a sense for if someone misses a week because they're on vacation, how self-contained, or should people really try to catch up before going to future sessions?
I think they'll be fairly self-contained. So I'm assuming in these that you have some machine learning background. So some of this might require a little bit of background knowledge just on that stuff, but I don't think that if you miss week 2, you're going to be completely screwed for week 3, because so like week 2, the plan was to gather some data, and the hope is that people can go out and gather their own data. But if you don't, I'll have that already ready and available so people can just reuse that piece. And if you don't know where that data came from, it's not super killer or anything. And I think that will be true all the way throughout. So I don't think I would encourage you to look at all the steps, but if you miss a week and can't catch up, that's probably fine. So yeah, there's comments about Google Colab Pro. I'll just be using the regular, but if you do plan on doing anything, it is nice to have the Pro. It gives you better GPU, more memory, more everything, longer runtime. So it's nice to have, but you will be able to handle things just on the free tier. So I will share this notebook, and then I will try to get us up and running. So there's the link to the notebook. I don't know if maybe we want to give people a second or two to sign up if they want. I can give a little overview while people are setting up. So Google Colab is this environment that gives you access to a Jupyter notebook, and this Jupyter notebook is running on Google servers. And so you don't actually have to run anything locally. If you have a Mac or Windows or Linux or whatever you're running, it doesn't really matter because it's going to run on their servers anyways. So you don't have any issues with installing packages or anything like that. It's all kind of already available. So you can just run this code on their systems. So one of the nice things about Colab is I can just share this link with you and then you run it and then it just opens it up and it's already running on their systems. So one of the things that I want to open us up with is by default, it will put you on a system just with CPU, and you probably want a GPU enabled. So I don't know if it will carry over my settings, but I want to kind of mention that if you don't have it set to GPU, it will probably be very, very slow. So what you want to do is go to runtime, change runtime type, and then set it to GPU, and that will make this process go much faster. It should, I've simplified it so it's only like a few minutes of training, so we can talk while it's training, but it's not going to take us hours. But if you do it on CPU, it will be hours. So you won't be able to follow along because your system will get stuck and then you'll have problems. If you want to edit the notebook, you might have to make a copy. So if you go over here, yeah, you might have to save a copy to your drive. So yeah, anyone need help setting this up? Should I pause for a second or can we move along? All right. I will carry us along then because no comment. So just starting off, why should we care about transformers? I think that this is important to start any learning process with, why am I doing this? Is this valuable? What is this going to lead to? And so many of you have probably heard about transformers lately. There's this extremely powerful architecture that has been dominating all kinds of different domains. So someone in the chat already mentioned images. So you can do stuff with images with transformers now, and that's state of the art. You can do stuff with text with image transformers, and that's state of the art. Object detection, time series, people are applying it to tabular data. Pretty much any kind of data that is around, people are throwing transformers at, and they're getting state of the art performance in. So it's a very, very valuable tool for data scientists to understand transformers, how to apply transformers, maybe how to adapt them to your problem type. So this is just a very valuable skill for anyone who's working in deep learning related stuff. So I highly recommend looking at this because this seems to be the future. This is where a lot of things are headed, and it has been a strong model for several years now. So just one of the sites that I wanted to point out, this Papers with Code, this website lets you look at a bunch of published papers, and then it's kind of aggregated the leaderboards for a bunch of different tasks. So you can see they've got computer vision tasks, they've got 181 different benchmark data sets and image classification. So I'll go to this one. So image classification, it's got all these benchmark data sets. So I'll look at ImageNet. And so it gives you this nice graph, and you can see kind of the progress over time of our model's accuracy on this specific benchmark. And so we can see that it started with AlexNet, and then we've kind of gotten better and better and better and better. And then eventually we've gotten to this visual image transformer. And so that's kind of state of the art right now. So we can see that over time, we've evolved to this, and these models have gotten very, very powerful. So if you look through the leaderboards of what are the top 50 now, almost all of them are transformers. So Swin is a transformer. All of these VIT ones are transformers. A lot of these have now combined convolutions and transformers or aspects of them. But if you look at these, a great deal of these are transformers now. So it's worth understanding this architecture, because it will get you the best results in most scenarios. So that papers with code, I highly recommend looking at that just on its own. You might have some task that you're interested in, and you can look at papers with code, and that will point you to the specific task or some specific benchmark data set or something that's relevant to your problem. And then you can look and see, like, here's all of the different things that people try, the different architectures and data prep and whatever else. And you can see what's the most accurate. And then it will also point you to the paper and the typically the code. So you can see it on GitHub and you can say, okay, I'm going to recreate what was placed here. So this is just this picture is showing the language modeling benchmarks. So you can see every single one of these is actually some variant of a transformer. So across all of these different data sets, transformer ended up being the best at them. So this is one of the reasons that we're looking specifically at transformers for text, because they've been dominant. There's no other option really at this point. And this is the visualization that I showed earlier, is just the evolution of how we've gone from ResNets and CNNs and that stuff, and eventually we've gotten to visual image transformers. So now we understand the importance of them. I just wanted to start going into a crash course on what transformers are. So this is a lengthy topic. We could spend an entire session on attention alone. So I won't necessarily go into too much detail on these. If we do have interest, maybe we could do an add-on session of just what is attention, what are the different flavors of it, how does it work, what are the internals of it. But for now, for at least week one, we're just going to skim past some of this. So in this notebook, I've shared the link to the original paper. So this is Attention is All You Need. It's a very well studied paper, very highly cited. A lot of people have done work based off of this paper. So if you're interested, I highly recommend reading it. And I believe I have, yeah. So there's a link to this annotated transformer, and they've done a really good job of annotating all of the pieces, implementing the code, and breaking down all of the nuts and bolts. And so you can see there's a whole lot here. So for now, we'll skip over this, but just understand that this transformer model, and inside of it, attention is very, very important. It's something that you should at least consider studying. For this week, we'll just be a little bit more practical. We'll look at the transformer library and understand how to apply it and stuff like that. But the attention mechanism and all of that stuff is kind of core to this advancement. So one of the things that I wanted to point out is, if you're familiar with machine learning stuff, not very much of this is actually new. So you've probably heard of embeddings, you've probably heard of addition and normalization, you've probably heard of feed-forward neural networks, you've probably heard of a linear layer, you've probably heard of a softmax. And so the really interesting part that you probably want to study is the multi-head attention. And then this transformer network is kind of just composing those pieces. So yeah, so that's the 1,000-foot view of what a transformer is. And then after that, I wanted to get into actually looking at that transformers package that we've mentioned a few times. So this is, there's this company, HuggingFace, and they have kind of taken ownership of all of Transformers. So they've implemented this library that brings everything together. So they've got a bunch of different versions of the Transformers, and they've aggregated the ones from Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, whoever else, anyone who's trained a model of note. They've kind of integrated them. And then they've also created a model hub that will store a lot of the smaller or less official work. So this HuggingFace package, very important. It simplifies a lot of this stuff. So if you want to train a transformer, you don't have to do it completely from scratch. You don't have to build all of this stuff that was in that annotated transformers package. You can just kind of call, hey, I want BERT. Hey, I want GPT. I want something else. You can just pull it in. You don't have to write 1,000 lines of attention and all of the layers and piece that all together. So I just want to focus in for a second on the, if you're trying to follow along, I'm looking under the models. So one of the things mentioned earlier is you can use this for vision and audio and a bunch of other stuff. We'll specifically be looking at the text models. And so, like I was mentioning earlier, HuggingFace has brought a lot of these under the same roof. And so there's all of these significant models that are kind of at your fingertips and fit in a single interface now. So the one that we'll specifically be looking at is BERT. And this is kind of one of the first ones that a lot of the work is derivative of now. So I think it's a good starting point for us to look at. So yeah, so the HuggingFace package, looking at the models that it provides, we can see specifically BERT, and we can see the official ones that have been integrated. But then we can also see, actually, I'll talk about that in a second. So this list is kind of the official ones that HuggingFace themselves have actually integrated in. And then they also have this model hub, which I think is very interesting and worth looking at. So they have this hub, it has all of these different models, a lot of these user uploaded actually, some of them from companies, some of them from individuals, and they've brought this all together so that you can kind of search based on task and use, and even whether they were PyTorch or TensorFlow, what languages, like we can see all of this stuff to this side here that you can filter by. So for example, if you want a translation model, you can filter by translation, and then you can see there's almost 2,000 models, and you can sort by the most downloaded ones. And these are nice because you can just bring in all of these piles of models through a standard interface. It will download them for you. It will usually help you prepare the inputs for you. So if you have images or text or whatever else, there's usually good examples of how do you prepare the inputs into this model, because I think that's a pretty typical problem is someone has this model, they publish it, and then they don't give you the specific directions of you have to open this in OpenCV2 or you have to tokenize it in such and such way. So this model hub is very useful for that. And if you want to fine tune one of these models, they typically have directions for that as well. So you have at your disposal 95,000 different models that have been trained on something, and a lot of the time you don't actually want to train something from scratch. So we'll be looking at that process, but very often what you really want to do is say, oh, I've got a problem that has Chinese, I'm going to pull BERT-based Chinese. You're not going to train it from scratch. So highly recommend looking at the model hub before you do any modeling, because typically you can look here and you can get a good starting point, something better than just starting from zero. So one of the things that I wanted to point out. So I I skimmed over some of the details of transformers, but I do want to dive into some of the broader parameters because it's useful to understand what these are and what they define, because you'll see these options in the library, and it's useful to understand the implications. So transformers, they if you think of kind of the stack of layers and what goes into them and what comes out of them, some of the most important parameters are the vocab size. So we'll talk about this in a little bit, but it's the number of tokens that the model actually understands. So for BERT, this is set to 30,522. And if you look at a bunch of other papers, you'll see that number repeated, because a lot of papers have just kind of copied off of BERT, and they've said, okay, we take BERT, let's use different data. Let's use a different pre-training task. Let's use some other trick to train it better. But a lot of people have just basically said, let's take this core architecture and we'll just reuse it. So you might see that 30,522 pretty often, because a lot of works have been based off of this. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that vocab size actually means. But it's the number of tokens that the model understands. And then after that, another one of the accidentally double-clicked. So one of the other important parameters is the hidden size. So that's the dimensionality that's used to represent some of the internals. And so you'll see that there might be multiple different models, and one of them might increase the hidden size, and that makes it higher dimensionality. So it's treating its tokens and some of its internals with more degrees of freedom. And so the way that I think of this is it's kind of like the width of the network. If you've ever worked with a dense network or a multi-layer perceptron, you might think of like, okay, I have a certain number of layers, and the layers are 100 neurons wide or 500 neurons wide or 1,000 neurons wide or something like that. And so that's what the hidden size is. It's the number of neurons for a given unit, basically. And so that's the width. That's the way I think of it, at least. And then beyond that, there's the number of hidden layers. And so the way that I think of this is like the depth. And so a common one for BERT and almost everything is they'll do a base model that's 12, and then they'll do a large that's 24. And then some people have gone crazy and done 48 and 96 and whatever else. And you can stack as many as you want or as few as you want. But I think of that as sort of the depth of the network. So you have these transformer blocks, and it's common for people to use like 12 as their baseline. They'll have 12 transformer blocks stacked all together, and that forms the model. And so one of the things that I want to point out is like the actual magnitude of this. So BERT base, when it first came out, that was like a colossal model. I was training models that had like 3 million parameters, 10 million parameters, maybe a little bit more than that. And then BERT came along and they were like, yeah, 110 million parameters. And that was like a huge model. Most people didn't have models that big. But since then, we've gone way beyond that. People have gone beyond 1 trillion parameters. So million, billion, trillion. Some people are speculating that GPT-4 is going to have 100 trillion parameters, which is like equaling the number of neurons in the brain. So just understanding like 100 million is a whole lot. You can represent a whole ton of information in 100 million. But those things that we're seeing now that are coming out, those are several orders of magnitude even bigger than BERT now. Things have scaled very significantly. And we'll talk about it in a later date, but some people have found that like you don't even get the behavior that you do on 100 million parameter model that you do on 1 trillion parameter model. It just doesn't even behave in the same way. So that's kind of one of those interesting avenues we might explore at a later date. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk in a little bit more detail about is this tokenization step. So we have this transformer model, and you need some numerical info to put into it. You can't just say, here's the input. The input is the word dog. You need to convert it to some number. And so a lot of work has been done in NLP to figure out what's the best way to actually represent this. And originally, we had word2vec and fast text and a few other techniques that basically said, let's learn some static vocabulary. We'll learn a vector for the word the, we'll learn a vector for the word dog, we'll learn a vector for the word ball. And then you end up with this text file that's 2 million lines long, trying to represent every word that they ever came across. And so that was a good technique to start, but what people have figured out is even better is you can do pieces of words or tokens. And so that actually gets you some commonality, but it also handles the case where you have never seen a word before. So one of the major problems with the old techniques was you have these 2 million words, and then someone enters some text that is just a minor typo. It's one character off. And then all of a sudden your model just goes, I have no idea what this word means. And so what this technique of tokenization gets around is it handles that. And so what the current tokenization in BERT and all of these other transformers model does is it breaks it up into pieces. So like I use the example, you might see the word ology in many different contexts. So biology, radiology, and then you can understand these words are actually related because they have this same suffix. These all have similar kind of meaning. Or you might have chem, you might have chemist, you might have chemical. And so you understand that those are related in some way. In the old techniques, you had no hope of doing that. You hoped that chemical and chemist ended up close to each other in the vector space, but you didn't have much guarantee because they were learning new vectors for every single word. And so what this does is it lets you operate on those smaller pieces, and then you can understand something about sort of the Latin roots of it. And so that tokenization, it solves that problem. It solves the out of vocabulary problem. So if you have a random sequence of characters, it's got the word pieces, so it can construct it even if it's not something that it's seen before. So if you spelled chemist wrong, if you use 2 S's, for example, it will just tokenize it up a little bit differently, but it will still see, oh, I see the chem part, I see ist, it's roughly the same. And so it will be able to understand maybe this is just a typo, but it will end up with a somewhat similar vector, hopefully. So that's what the 30,522 represents. It's not words, it's tokens. So those tokens can be chem, it could be ist, it could be the, it could be, so it can be actual words, but very often it might just be like AR or TR or something like that. It's just kind of like pairs of characters or even individual characters. So you can represent anything in this vocabulary with these tokens. And so that's kind of it for the legwork. And then now I want to get us into actually running some code. And so we'll see some examples of this in action. We'll get all the way to the end and we'll do some fine tuning and we'll show all of the different pieces of HuggingFace. So just going line by line, we're just importing NumPy, importing PyTorch. So HuggingFace can actually work with PyTorch or TensorFlow, depending on the model. Some models only have implementations in one or the other. But for all of this, we'll be using PyTorch. I have worked with both, but I'm more comfortable with PyTorch at this point. So that's what we'll be using for all of this. And then after that, we will be installing the transformers. So this one is from HuggingFace. That's the one that I showed earlier that had all of the models that we were looking at, and then we'll also install data sets. And this one is also from HuggingFace. And this one is kind of similar to the models that we were seeing. It's a repository with all of the common data sets. So people have uploaded their data sets, and then you can download them back down for various benchmark tasks and whatever else. You can even upload your own if you have something special that you want to put up on the dataset hub. So this installs and imports the stuff that we need. And then we have the data sets. So from data sets, we're importing load data set. This is a function that will just load in a bunch of known data sets. So for this example, we'll be doing the Yelp review full. And what this does is it will download a whole bunch of text and labels corresponding to some Yelp reviews, and then they've been labeled in a few different ways, so we can look at that and understand the pieces inside of it. So this ran. What it did is it downloaded the data set, and then it prepared it in this little data set object for us. And then we can look specifically at what's inside of this. So this, we're looking at the 100th sample of this data set, and we can see that the label is 0, and then we can see all of the text that was associated with that Yelp review. So we have the label, we have the text, and then from there we can do some work with this. So first step here, you don't have to worry about the details of this too much. I just basically took a subset of the data, so we weren't training for hours. I'm taking 1,000 rows for training, 1,000 rows for testing, and then we can just work on that small subset of the data. And then looking at this, nothing has really changed. It's just now we're looking at a subset of the data set. So this one has label 4, and then here's some text along with it. Would it help if I made this any larger? I don't know if anyone having problems reading this.
If you could zoom in a little bit, that'd be a little helpful.
Sure.
I think that's good.
Cool. So I mentioned that tokenization step. One of the nice things about the transformers package is it brings all of those along for you. So multiple different tokenization techniques have come about. So some people do byte pair encoding, some people do word piece, some people do other things. And so you want to make sure that you're doing the right tokenization associated with the model. Otherwise, your vocabulary is going to be messed up. It's not aligned. And so the auto tokenizer does a good job of keeping track of this for you. So we can import our BERT base cased model, and we can also import the tokenizer, and it will make sure that we get the correct one associated with our model. So you can plug in whatever you want in here. You can do Roberta, you can do Deberta, and it will just pull in the tokenizer that is relevant to that specific model. So one of the things that I didn't touch on earlier is there's a lot of published models for different scenarios. So we saw the Chinese BERT, and then for this, there's also different versions that have been trained, some of them cased, some of them uncased. So when you see that, it means the case version means that it has vocabulary for uppercase and lowercase. The uncased version means that it only has lowercase text. So if you do have an uncased model, you want to make sure that you lowercase all of your text before you pass it to any of these functions. Otherwise, it won't understand the vocabulary there. It will just say, I don't understand what capital R in Ryan means. So just a word of warning. You want to pay attention to that because it can cause problems for you. So we load in the tokenizer. So this is bringing in the vocabulary and whatever method is applied to tokenize some text. And then we want to do a couple things to make it good for training for us. So one of the limitations of these models is they have a maximum sequence length. So you can only have up to a certain amount of tokens. So for BERT and many other models, the maximum length is 512. So you can fit 512 word pieces to go into the model, and then beyond that, it can't fit anymore. And so you can do various different things to chop the text into pieces and do multiple passes through the model or something like that, or you can just truncate it. So you can just cut it to a shorter length. So you can say, okay, the most important is the first 512, so I'm just going to look at that anyways, and then anything beyond that I don't care about, so I'm just going to throw it away. And so that's one step of it. Is you might want to cut it at the maximum length, so it's 512. And then the other step is you probably want to pad it because you have text of varying length. You might have something that's 37 tokens, you might have something that's 100, you might have something that's 200. And if you want to stack that in a nice array to then pass to your model, you want them all to be the same size. And so you can pad it to whatever the appropriate length is. And there's various different tricks there that you can apply that will make your training more efficient. But the simplest is just to say my maximum length is 512, so I'm going to make it 512 every time. So if the text was only 37, I'm going to add on however many tokens to make it 512 again. And then you can just pass this whole block of data to your model, and then it will process them all as a batch.
I have one question over here. So could you please tell me, like, again, repeat the maximum length 128 over here?
Yeah, so this padding portion, what that is doing is it's saying pad this until it reaches the maximum length. So if you set your max length for this, I set it to 128 just to make it smaller and faster for us. So if a text had 50 tokens, it will pad it to 128. So it'll just add blank tokens basically until it reaches 128. Is that the part you were asking about?
Yeah, and can you show us an example where how much the length is for one token over here in this particular example that you're showing?
Yeah. We'll see that in a second. I have printouts lower in the notebook because
Okay.
I do think it's important to see what that looks like.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Ryan, quick question. Let's say your document is, let's say, 8,000 words and all of them are important. So what do you do in that case? Do you have two blocks of transformers, or like if you cannot cut it at 512 words?
So there's some models that can handle longer sequences. So you might want to look at a model that is able to handle longer sequences. There's like Longformer and various other things that can handle like 4,000. And I think there's even longer out there. But a typical thing would be to just break it up in chunks. So if you have 8,000 words, you do multiple 512 chunks of words, and then you get output from all of them, and then you can kind of aggregate that in some way. If you're doing classification, you can say, let's take the average or the maximum of all of those outputs from the 512 sequences.
Okay,
Yeah,
I got it.
Yeah, it depends on your task, but that is one way to handle it.
Okay, I have more concrete question about it. So you divided it by chunks, and your text are letters. And they start with some kind of greetings, then goes some kind of prehistory, then maybe something, pleasantries, and at the end we have a rejection. So if you want to learn the sentiment, how we will deal with the chunks?
I think in that scenario, what I would probably do is have it output the sentiment for every chunk individually, and then I would, depending on what I'm trying to do, I would take the average of all of those chunks, or I would take the maximum. That's what I would probably do. And it's a little bit limited because you might have something that is actually between those chunks important, so you don't have the context of the previous pieces. But that's just ultimately what you have to do. And some people, the way that I've just described it, you do it in chunks. So you have 8,000 and then you do 512, 512, 512 in consecutive pieces. But you can do it as more of like a rolling window where you say, I have 512, I'm going to move it forward 256 tokens. And then now I've got overlapping pieces from all of that before. So hopefully you can get more of that captured. But yeah, if you have long text, it becomes harder.
Thanks.
A question on that. So when you say that there'll be some overlapping pieces, won't it duplicate or our conclusion or the sentiment? Or like, won't it change the sentiment, which had to be there?
Potentially, yeah. So, but that's kind of what you want. It would be nice if I had some diagram of that sliding window idea, but ultimately, you having overlap is typically desirable because you if you think about it, you have your 8,000 tokens, and you do 512, and then if you did the next 512, you only have the limited context of those 512 on their own. If you do the overlap, then you don't miss as much context in between chunks. But yeah, I mean, you are giving something up if you're doing sequences longer than 512 with a model that can only do 512. There's no, I mean, you can accurately do things with text longer than 512, but you have to kind of acknowledge that you have to aggregate that in some way.
Okay, thank you.
Hey Ryan, if I can hop in for a second.
Yeah,
so
go for it.
there's been like a pretty big bottleneck with the sequence length for transformers. Like if we notice, different models have different sequence lengths, but it's also a pretty active area of research where people are trying to deal with how to solve that. So there's different like accelerators and state-of-the-art papers that kind of come out to try to deal with this. Like something that's pretty new is a technique called flash attention, where I think they're able to push sequence length to almost 64,000 tokens as opposed to 512. And it's also done faster. So there's ongoing research that comes out with stuff like that. And what it's essentially doing is recalculating how it calculates attention. There's techniques like sparse attention as opposed to a regular like multi-headed attention. So papers like that are also coming out. HuggingFace is doing a good job at trying to help implement some of these in your actual code, but that's getting into like very high-end, state-of-the-art, like latest research that's still being published. Like these papers are coming out like, in the past few months. But if it's a problem that people have to deal with, I think when it comes to sequence length, the more common answers are trying to see, okay, if I'm doing sentiment analysis, in a lot of cases, I can kind of just concatenate like the first half, the last half of my samples, I'll probably be able to do pretty well. If you're really in a case where you really need to deal with such long sequences, Sometimes you can try summarizing the text down to a shorter sequence length. There's many approaches that you can take, but if you really want to deal with the full sequence length, that's where some of these like latest research papers come in, trying stuff like flash attention, things like that. There's approaches, but oftentimes what we see is that you can kind of try other approaches to get to where you need to get.
Yeah. Thanks, Vibu.
Yeah.
And yeah, Hobbs has some good comments in the chat. So one of the problems, so the models are typically trained with a max length of 512 or whatever they're set to. You can start them at different things. But the part of the struggle is, well, why don't you just set it to 1,000 or 2,000 or 4,000? The problem is the scaling. The scaling is not very good. When you double the sequence length, you're making it 4 times as much compute. And if you keep doing that doubling, you end up with something that's just impossible to handle. So that was actually one of the things that I did to speed up this training. It was originally set to 512. I changed it to 128, and that makes it so that our training is only a minute per epoch, because it's a shorter sequence length, so it makes our training much, much faster. But we can run this now that we've talked about it a bit. All of this output is just saying basically, hey, we loaded in the BERT tokenizer. Here's the parameters. We got some from the tokenizer JSON, vocab text file, added tokens, special tokens. We haven't discussed those, but maybe we look at those at some point. And so, yeah, so we tokenized our data there, and now we can look at like what does it actually look like once it's been tokenized. So we'll look at these different steps. So here's the text again. This is what actually went into the tokenizer. I thought it was funny that this mentioned San Diego. That was just a completely random coincidence. But here's the text that's associated with that row. Here's the label. So this is class 1. And then we can look at what the actual input IDs are. And so this is what I was talking about, where we have mapped the pieces of these to then indexes of the vocabulary that we've assigned. So there's some embedding at location 101 that represents the word or piece of the word this, probably. And so we can't directly tell from going from here to here and understand what the pieces are. So what I did is I looked down here and I said, okay, what happens when we do the backward step? We tokenized it, let's untokenize it. Let's see what those constituent pieces are. And so undoing the tokenization step, we can see that we actually start with the CLS token. And so this is one of the special tokens that we haven't talked about, but it's basically for classifying. You will look at the output at that specific token, and then that can be for specifically classifying things. But looking at the tokens that we probably care about a bit more, we see that this mapped to 1188 is mapped to 1110. And it's kind of interesting because all of these, we have vocabulary for these specific words, but then when we start getting to sequences that we don't have full tokens for or full words for, it splits it up into smaller pieces. So we don't have the word sushi in our vocabulary, but we do have the root su, and then the later piece shi. And so you can tell that something is the second piece of the same word by this double pound sign. And so anytime you see the double pound sign, you know that that's a continuation of the previous word. So we can see that this used to be possibly, it was all together. And so to the question earlier, this is what it looks like once it's been tokenized. This is the untokenized version back to text, and this is the actual tokens that will go into the model.
I have a question. The labels are like encoded integer labels right now. Is there like an original string label somewhere for each of these? Do we know?
I'm not sure I follow the question. Could you explain that a little bit?
If you look at small trained data set 0, and then you look at the label, it's label 1. But does that label correspond to a word, right? Like, is there a set of like, I don't know, like, you know, is there a label for Thai food and then another label for like gas stations or whatever, and then you map each of those onto numbers, or or are the labels just sort of like, what do the labels represent?
Yeah, so for this one, they're not labeled in a great way. I assume that this actually maps to like very negative, negative, neutral, positive, very positive, because they're Yelp reviews. But typically you would have some mapping from those integers to some actual string. So for example, for us, the model is telling us that this ID to label thing is storing that mapping from one to the other. So for example, we can see that 1 is actually mapped to label 1, which is not a very useful name, but
Right, and in this case, these are Yelp stars. So 1 star, 2 star,
Okay.
3 star. Yeah, that's what they are.
Gotcha.
So it kind of
Yeah.
makes sense in this case. But if it was more abstract, like if we were categorizing fruit like apple, pear, banana, 1, 2, 3 doesn't help. In this case, stars kind of correlate, but
Yeah, thanks, Kiva. But yeah, so the model, if someone sets it up right, you can store that mapping inside of the model, so you can keep track of that, because the output is going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but you probably want to map that to some actual apple, banana, whatever else. So yeah, before we talked about the auto tokenizer, and then now we can look at the auto model. And so there's various different tasks that you might want to do with the model. So for this, we'll be doing sequence classification, but there's all kinds of different things that you might want to do. So what people typically do is they take these pre-trained models and then they find some other task to apply them to. And they will do this transfer learning onto them. And so in the transformers package, they can basically say, I'm going to take that backbone that was pre-trained on something, and then we're going to put a new final layer on it just for this specific task. So for us, the auto model for sequence classification is basically saying we're going to put a new linear layer at the end of it that's going to map to these 5 classes. So this auto model for sequence classification, we're going to load our BERT base case pre-trained model, and then we want it to have 5 labels. So it's going to make it so our output has 5 neurons. And so this will load in the model. And then from there, we will, so the second piece of this, we have our data, we have our model, and then we can use one of the HuggingFace trainers. And so the trainers are interesting in that they can kind of abstract a lot of the training logic away from you. So you probably want to do a forward pass, a backwards pass, you want to clear out your loss, you want to measure the training performance, you want to measure the validation performance, and this kind of gives you a simplified interface to do that. You don't have to write 50 lines of code for your training loop. You just say, okay, here's my trainer, I want to run training, here's my input data set, here's my validation data set, here's the metric that I want to use, and then it will kind of handle all of the rest of that. And so this is useful to use, but we'll also look at another method if we have time, which is kind of doing it the manual way again, because that gives you more control. The trainers are really nice, but it also kind of limits your flexibility. So just with that preface, the trainer arguments is just giving us some options that we can throw into to define what we want the model to use. So training arguments, I don't have this printed out anywhere, but it has a whole bunch of defaults. Oh, there we go. Here's all the defaults. So you can see it's got a certain learning rate that's already set. You can see that there's whether you want to do validation or not. There's all kinds of stuff in there that it's just kind of setting the default for. And then you can overwrite that in any way that you want. So if you wanted to, we could just say batch size something, learning rate this, we can enter all of that. But if you don't really want to tune that or touch it right now, you can just use the defaults and you don't have to worry about it. So this is what the training arguments does. And then we will also install the evaluate package. This is coming from HuggingFace again. I haven't used evaluate a whole lot. I don't entirely see much purpose for it. I guess it's nice to have your metrics all gathered in a single library, but a lot of them are simple enough that it's like, I can do this myself. So we import the evaluate metric or the evaluate library, and then we load in the accuracy metric, which is just, does it match or not? So we'll see if our predictions match what the labels say. So they write this little compute metrics function, and then you have your predictions. This is a little bit misleading because it's actually the predictions get split into the logits, which is like the actual output from the model. And then the labels is the actual labels of the models. The eval pred is kind of overloaded here. And then from the predictions or from the logits, the output will be a probability of some sort. And so we need to simplify this to some actual prediction. So if it's saying there's 70% class 0, 10% class 1, and so on and so on, we wanted to just eventually say the output is class 1 because that was what was the maximum. So that's what this compute metrics is doing, is you take the argmax to get the actual class output, and then you're computing some metric to say, we thought it was class 1. Does that match with the labels? That's what this is showing. And then more training arguments, kind of fast forward just to get us through this. And then we have the trainer. So this is taking the model, the training args, the data that we want to pass for training. And then we have the evaluation data set, the data that we want to evaluate against. We have the compute metrics. And then to actually, so this defines the trainer. And then if we want to actually do the training, we do trainer.train, and that will actually trigger the training, and we can see it's starting to run. We can see that we passed it 1,000 samples like we expected. We're training it for 3 epochs. We're doing a batch size of 8. We saw that was the default. We can see that the trainable parameters is like 110 million. Mentioned earlier, right now it's running evaluation. So we can see that it got accuracy of 45%. And so it will continue training for about a minute or so. So we're at 1:30. This last portion is not crucial. So I think we might end it here. So this last portion, for anyone who has the notebook up, basically what it's doing is it's doing the same thing as the trainer, except for instead of using the trainer, it's doing everything manually. So the important part is down here. You have this training loop, and it's a pretty simple one, but it's just saying, I'm just going to write this in PyTorch. I'm not going to use the trainer. So if you do this, you have full custom control of however you want to do logging and forward and backward pass and all of that stuff. So yeah, we are at 1:30. I will pause for questions. Happy to answer anything if anyone wants anything.
Hey, I might have to drop off, but can you tell me like where the recording will be there to access for us?
Yeah, there was a link earlier in the chat.
I posted the YouTube channel. They're shared too. I'll post it
Yeah.
again in the chat if we need.
Yeah,
Thanks,
that would
Susan.
be helpful. I think I joined late, so I missed the link.
If we're on Slack, I can post it in Slack as well, and we can pin it or something.
Yeah, sure. That would be helpful.
I just posted it here in the Zoom meeting. I'll share it in Slack in a few minutes.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
I
Yeah,
think there's
great.
also the GitHub where we post the talks and book club stuff, and I think we link the videos there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have not created anything for this series yet, but in talks, I will put something for this Transformer series. And I'm not exactly sure, Ryan, how good we can be about uploading the video quickly, but once we get it uploaded, then I'll put a link there on GitHub too.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So this would be a perfect time if anyone has anything that they specifically want to cover in future sessions. I'm very open to suggestions. So yeah, if anyone has anything that they're looking to specifically learn, happy for suggestions and guidance.
I think a conversation around the attention mechanism would be cool, because I think transformers are great, but understanding the underlying mechanisms would be nice.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's what I've read the Transformers Are All You Need paper like 4 times, and when we get to the key value pair stuff, like for some reason I just like can't build an intuition around it. So I think that would be super nice to have some discussion about that.
Yeah. Okay, we can do that then.
Have you seen one of those animations from DeepMind on attention? I can remember.
Oh, is there a link somewhere? I didn't know that existed.
I'll look for it now.
That'd be
Jay
awesome.
Almer's blog is also pretty good with animations on the attention paper. That's a good one.
What's his name?
Jay Almer. Oh,
Yeah, Jay Almar has the illustrated Transformer blog post. And there's whatever, like Illustrated Bert or something like that. I got a link to that too, but if you Google that, you'll definitely find it. One sec.
Yeah, I think
there's one in the chat. Yeah.
The animations I saw were just they were much more elegant than the stuff I'm seeing on the. I'm thinking of they were like Plotly sort of. They were awesome. Anyway, I'll find them.
Yeah, and I think we can go over it. I do feel, Ryan, like even for people who get the gist of it, that sometimes the way people talk about attention, I feel like it doesn't necessarily capture the real essence of it. Like that people don't necessarily have the intuition even when they know exactly how the query key stuff works.
Yeah. We've had discussions on that in the past. We should have recorded it.
I think some of my talks went slightly into the attention stuff. Some of my transformer talks I gave for this group. I also gave a talk straight on attention at some point, which wasn't recorded, but I have the slides for. I don't know if it was with this group or not, but yeah, a talk on that's always nice.
Yeah.
Vibu,
Cool.
can you post your slides someplace, or do you have them someplace?
Yeah, I can post them. I'll just have to dig them up and maybe clean them up a little, but of course I can post them.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
So
Any
adding-
other questions, comments, requests?
For outside of NLP and computer vision, there's also the audio stuff on HuggingFace.
Yep, they're applied a lot of different places. Time series too. People have done stacks of transformers for tabular data as well. There's people are applying them to everything. They're very general actually.
Stable Diffusion uses it. So
Mhm.
There's a pretty interesting new paper that just came out on like advancements in time series for transformers. I haven't read it yet, but it seems pretty promising.
Interesting.
All right. So Ryan, maybe we'll end the formal recording here.